In this Elden Ring video, I'm going to be showing you my Inquisitor build. This is a level 150 build that is a strength dexterity quality build that uses the Ghiza's wheel weapon to great effect. Before I get into the build though, I just want to give you a heads up. Probably the next build I'm going to do, a lot of people have been asking for a Malekith's Black Blade build. That's probably going to be the build I'm going to do next. That's going to probably be an NG plus build, so stay tuned for that if you're interested in that weapon. Okay, so let's talk about the Inquisitor a little bit. The first thing I want to talk about is obviously Ghiza's wheel and this Colossal weapon. We showcased this a bit in our Colossal weapons video, and I actually really liked playing around with this weapon. But there are a couple things to know about this weapon. First of all, the spinning wheel weapon skill of this weapon does not function the way you would think. When you use it on an enemy by holding L2, it hits them over and over, but the game does not consider this separate attacks for some reason. It only considers it like one attack, or it considers it separate attacks, but it doesn't trigger things like, Winged Sword Insignia or Millicent's Prosthesis, as I mentioned in that video, which means that you're not going to get like increasing damage with each rotation of that like you really should. Additionally, it doesn't really trigger bleed buildup the way you'd think it was. I think it does a percentage of the blood loss buildup of the weapon each spin instead of the full value, or even like not even half. I'd say it does like maybe 10 to 20% of the buildup per rotation, which means you really have to hold it on an enemy a very long time in order to trigger bleed buildup high enough to trigger hemorrhage on them if you're using spinning wheel. Essentially, this makes this weapon skill pretty much useless. You're not going to be able to go up to an enemy and just hold this on them, maybe if you stun lock them long enough to kill them, when, you're not going to be able to do it like on a boss or any, meaningful, difficult fight. However, if you use the R2 attack, either two-handed or one-handed, the blades will actually spin at the end of that attack, and they will trigger extra ticks for blood buildup and extra ticks that will proc Rotten Winged Sword Insignia or Winged Sword Insignia, etc., or the Thorny Crack tier. So these are what you want to go for, and because the one-handed moveset actually makes the weapon spin in front of you compared to the two-handed moveset that makes it spin behind you, you're primarily going to want to use it one-handed because you just want it to land on the enemy in front of you and keep spinning on them. So really, this build is going to focus around using one-handed R2s and charged R2s in order to deal increased damage to enemies and to trigger, things like Rotten Winged Sword Insignia on them and hemorrhage on them to boost your attack power higher and get the most out of those R2s and charged R2 attacks. Now, because the primary means of damage that comes from this build is from R2 attacks, not a weapon skill or some spell, that frees up our offhand for something else, like a shield, and you might as well use a shield if you're going to use this build because you want the one-handed R2 specifically because it ends with the spin in front of you. There's no reason to have a second weapon if you're using that ability. In the offhand, we have a great shield, which allows you to do block counters, but what's really great about the Jellyfish shield is that it also boosts your damage by 20% with its buff, and it has a very low FP cost. So not only can you do block counters very effectively with this build, but you can also buff the damage of that R2 even further, which makes it a fantastic pairing for this build. Beyond that, the armor that you use for this build isn't super important. You're not going to have enough equip load to use a very high poise armor because you have a great shield equipped and because you have a Colossal weapon equipped. So you're not going to be able to use like super duper armor out there unless you want a heavy roll, which is fine. But it's not super important because the R2s and charged R2s of this weapon typically give you hyper armor anyway, and you can usually poise through attacks even without high poise armor. When it comes to the talismans for this build, there are 3 that I basically keep slotted the whole time, and then there is kind of a flex spot. So let me run you through them. I have Rotten Winged Sword Insignia, although Millicent's Prosthesis would probably work better in this case. I just didn't have it on this build for whatever reason. The Axe Talisman, and Lord of Blood's Exaltation. So Rotten Winged Sword Insignia or Millicent's Prosthesis, whichever one you have, is going to increase your damage as you hit rapidly. And as I mentioned, this works well with this weapon because of the spins of the blades that's unique to this weapon afterward. Otherwise, I wouldn't recommend these on a Colossal weapon build because they attack very, very slowly. The reason Millicent's Prosthesis is probably the better of the two options here is because it gives you 5 Dexterity, which would then free up 5 points to put in something like Endurance. You need a lot of stamina with this build because you are blocking and the shield you're blocking with doesn't have great guard boost. And attacking with Colossal weapons consumes a lot of stamina. So having high endurance is not only good for better armor, but also good for stamina. So being able to free up those 5 points can give you a little bit more endurance, which is good. The Axe Talisman is there because charged R2s are going to be your, or R2s are going to be your primary means of damage. This will boost your charged R2s, not your regular R2s, but you're going to be using those charged R2s a lot to get even more damage and more stagger out of them. So it works really well in this build. And finally, Lord of Blood's Exaltation here is really good because you're going to proc Hemorrhage very easily because of the rotations of that blade, and then that'll boost your attack power even higher. You could also use White Mask for your armor as well if you want to be like 100% min-maxed. There's no reason you can't use that. That would give you even more attack power, so consider using White Mask if you're using this build. I just didn't for fashion, but if you're talking about total optimization, White Mask would be a better fit. So besides those talismans, in my flex spot, I basically switch between the Claw Talisman or the Ritual Sword Talisman. And that's because sometimes you want to do jump attacks with this weapon and get a little bit more damage out of it. It's very strong jump attack. It usually staggers enemies for a second or makes them flinch, allowing you to follow up with an R1 and finish them off. Or I'll use Ritual Sword Talisman to also increase my R2 attacks even more, particularly when I'm handling like trash areas of the game, so I can maybe I don't have just enough damage to one-shot enemies. This will make sure that I do. It really depends. If you're fighting tough enemies, sometimes you're not going to be at full health the whole time, and Ritual Sword Talisman isn't as good. But sometimes you just don't get hit, and also because you're using a Great Shield and you're going to be able to do block counters, you could use the Curved Sword Talisman as well. So really the strategy with this build is going around the landscape doing block counters on trash, typically one-shotting them. If not, then you can follow up with a critical strike because you usually stagger them in one block counter. But then using R2 or charged R2 on enemies to trigger that buildup from like Rotten Winged Sword Insignia or Millicent's Prosthesis. You could use both Millicent's Prosthesis and like Winged Sword Insignia or Rotten Winged Sword Insignia if you have it as well in tandem with this build to get even more buildup if you want. It's not absolutely necessary, but it would absolutely give you more damage. And the reason it's important to trigger this right away is because that buff only lasts a small duration. So if you go from enemy to enemy, keep using this, then you'll keep that buff up and you'll keep your damage high, allowing you to just keep chewing through enemies as your damage gets higher and higher. Now, when you get to tough enemies and bosses, usually what I try and do is get like charged R2 off, dodge their attacks, and end up in a position where if I can't get a charged R2, I get a regular R2 because the wheel will still spin. But if I can, I'll try and get a charged R2 or do jump attacks, because once they're staggered and an enemy is down on the ground, then you can do that charged R2 while they're laying there and hopefully get really big damage numbers from that charged attack. Because sometimes you can hit from 3,000 to 4,000 damage with a charged R2 with this weapon, depending on how many buffs you have up from triggering Hemorrhage or from hitting repeatedly already. Block counters are definitely harder to pull off against tougher enemies because usually they're very aggressive or they don't bounce off your weapon. Sometimes you're fighting like a dragon, block counters are just not an option. So usually you're going to be doing jump attacks against tough enemies, or you're going to be going for those R2 and charged R2s. The stats I have for this build are 50 Vigor, 13 Mind, 34 Endurance, 50 Strength, 50 Dexterity, 9 Intelligence, 14 Faith, and 9 Arcane. Disregard the Intelligence, Faith, and Arcane. That's because of my class. You don't really need any of them. You could have 25 Faith in this build and go like Golden Vow and Flame Grant Me Strength if you want. I don't particularly want to keep buffing with them. I already have to buff with Jellyfish Shield as it is. So that's an option if you want, but I just recommend having those as low as possible. 50 Vigor is really there to give you enough health to survive hits. And for Mind, you literally don't need hardly any Mind with this build. Contagious Fury costs like 9 FP or something and lasts 30 seconds. And that's literally the only thing you spend FP on in this build because all the rest of your damage comes from block counters or charged R2 or R2 attacks. So you absolutely need no points in Mind whatsoever. Endurance is there in order to give you enough equip weight that you can use all this stuff and still medium roll, and also to give you more stamina when you're blocking. As I mentioned, the Jellyfish Shield only has like 60 guard boost or so, 57, something like that, maxed out. So you're going to eat a lot of stamina when you block with it, even if enemies rebuff off it. It's not going to be as effective as some great shields that have like 70 to 80 or even 90 guard boost. So you don't take as much stamina damage when you block. With this, you will, so you'll need that extra stamina so that you can block counter and still have stamina left, or you can keep swinging this weapon because it chews through a lot of stamina when you attack. This weapon scales very well with Strength and Dexterity, about evenly, I would say. So we've hit the breakpoints here of about 50 of each. If you're using Millicent's Prosthesis, then you only need to take Dexterity up to 45. That would free up 5 more points for something like Endurance. But otherwise, you want to keep these about 50, and then you'll take these up to 80 if you play this build into NG+. And then from that point forward, your damage is really not really going to go too much further. I mean, you can keep increasing Strength and Dexterity beyond that, but you're going to get very negligible returns. And one final tip for this build, if you're using the Flask of Wondrous Physique, you want to use 2 tiers. You want to use the one that increases your charged attack damage, and you want to use the one that increases your damage on successive attacks. Both of those apply to this build, and they're both very, very good. Another option, if you don't have either of these, is the Green Burst Crystal tier, which will give you stamina recovery. Stamina recovery is absolutely phenomenal, and anytime you're blocking, getting more stamina recovery is good, because you go through, when you do a block counter, you not only go through the stamina to block, but then the attack, and you go through stamina very, very fast. So that wraps up our Inquisitor build. The next build, as I mentioned, is probably going to be a Malekith's Blackblade build, so if you want to see that build, stay tuned for the next video.